Hello, and welcome back into another edition of the Sun Devil Source podcast presented by Jones Auto Centers. I'm your host, Jacob Brooks, and alongside me, as always, is our Sun Devil Source publisher, Chris Cartman. Chris, it's Friday. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. Finally, things slowing down from the transfer portal. That's making my life a little bit easier. And now we're gonna pour into evaluating all these players. But Bobby Hurley's comments after that basketball game, that's something we have to talk about first.
Yeah, that's going to be the first thing we touch on in this episode. Let's just skip the pleasantries and go straight into it, because it was a very eerie doom and gloom vibe in that press conference room after ASU's loss to West Virginia on Wednesday night. It was a 75-63 loss. And after the game, Bobby Hurley had a lot to say. He appeared very dejected. Chris, you asked him if this is the most demoralized he's felt after a loss. He said yes. He had a lot of other things to say. He said that the team, quote unquote, we failed. Then he said, quote, I am failing. Then he said that the team doesn't have a commitment to listening. Then he went on to say that ASU's home environment has been, quote unquote, sterile, and that ASU does not play well at home and has not played well at home since before the COVID-19 pandemic, and that the team does not give home fans a reason to show up, a reason to pack the stands, and a reason to bring enthusiasm and energy. That's a lot to unpack, Chris. What did you make of that press conference and everything that Hurley had to say?
Yeah, pretty bleak stuff, right? I feel like in recent weeks, Hurley's has been trending toward an increasing amount of frustration and building negative sentiment that's been difficult for him. Clearly, he needs to have some success with this team as a demonstration for himself to continue at ASU, and that's just escaping them. They've had some injuries and some things that haven't gone their way, and they've been playing out with 7 and 8 man rotations and been a bit shorthanded and unlucky. But as he correctly said, they've also just not executed in key situations. He talked about the end of the first half when West Virginia hit a 3, when he had told his players that they had fouls to give and they should take one there, and Noah Mausen didn't do it. And then Hurley went out onto the court and really was kind of, telling him, hey, like, that was a big mistake at the end of the half. And also, quite honestly, like, this team has had irregular intensity. Like, they went to Tucson and they played a very spirited game, 40 minutes, not nearly as good as Arizona, and they lost, but it was ultra competitive, primarily because of just how much they competed. But then you see ASU in these home losses that they've had in the Big 12 in recent weeks, and they haven't competed to that same intensity level for 40 minutes. And even the players have acknowledged, like, rebounding is mostly just effort. And this has been a team that's been below average to mediocre with its securing its defensive glass, even despite starting 3 players who are 6'10" or taller. And that being one of the issues that they've been dealing with. But when Hurley says that they're not listening to me in the huddle, okay, that's a very alarming thing. Like he said, they're tuning him out. Okay, well, he's a passionate and very expressive coach, and it's almost to the point where his level of despair and encouragement, given the bleak circumstances, is being tuned out to some degree by his players. And if that happens, then you're almost like saying the quiet part out loud about losing your team to some degree. Yeah. And look, there were a lot of ASU fans who felt like Bobby Hurley shouldn't be coaching anymore after the things that he expressed in that press conference. I personally don't feel that way. But as somebody who's been in all of his home press conferences for as long as he's been coaching at ASU, 11 years now, I do sense that something is different now than even some of the negative, more dire commentary that he's had in prior seasons. This feels like the end of the line. And I feel like Hurley kind of understands that's where we're at.
And Chris, when you mention that that's where we're at, how did this crash happen so fast? Because ASU, yes, was picked to finish last in the Big 12 in both the coaches poll and media poll. People came into this season when ASU had 14 scholarship newcomers and were like, okay, don't expect much from this team. But the vibes during the early part of the season weren't awful. ASU went to the Maui Invitational and really turned heads. There was the whole Maui Mo thing with his performance against Texas. There was hype surrounding Masamba Diop and if he could potentially be an NBA guy a couple years down the line. ASU received votes in an AP poll not even 2 months ago. So how did this all come crashing down so fast?
The Big 12 is just dramatically tougher than the non-conference.
Yeah.
A lot of these players, you mentioned Mo Odom, he came from Pepperdine. He played well against Gonzaga and other teams as somebody who played at a lower level. And he had success in Maui, including against Texas and Sean Miller's team. But mostly they're just playing a way tougher schedule in the conference play. And also they've had some injuries where they haven't had a full complement of their roster. And I think that the cumulative effect of that, and Hurley mentioned this, they played in a matter of like whatever it was, 2 weeks. They played at BYU. That's a top 15 team. I think they're 12th in the net rankings. Then they played at Arizona. They're third in the net rankings. Then they played Houston, which is 10th in the net rankings. Like they played 3 top 15 teams in just a couple weeks in January. And they're not nearly as good as those teams. And then the teams that they lost to at home, they are, maybe roughly comparable to, or maybe not quite as good at. It's like West Virginia is 59th in the NCAA net rankings. Colorado 78th. ASU is 93rd. ASU is 15th in among the Big 12 teams, ahead of only Utah. So the bottom line is they're playing better teams. These opponents have a better idea about ASU's roster at this point because it was a almost entirely new roster. The scouting of that roster much harder to do in the non-conference early when they hadn't played a lot of games together and people didn't really know what to expect from who these players are. Well, now there's a much better understanding of what you have to do to be successful against ASU. And I mentioned earlier the lack of intensity being consistent across 40 minutes in a lot of these games. That certainly cannot happen when a team is already a little bit shorthanded because of injuries and also not as talented as many of the others in the Big 12, and they don't execute in crucial situations either. In a lot of these games, you put all those things together, and you have the situation that ASU is now in.
And Chris, you talked about earlier how Bobby's comments might have been signaling that this is different than in past years and that the end might be near for a coach who's in the final year of his contract and is one of the longest tenured men's basketball coaches in the history of Arizona State. Do you anticipate something happening here in the now, potentially over the next couple of weeks after only a handful more of conference games? Or do you think this is something where Graham Rossini and all of ASU athletics is just going to kind of let this ride out over the course of the season and then evaluate after the year?
I think you have to have an ongoing evaluation process. You can't predetermine that you're going to let it ride out until the end of the season, especially not after what Hurley said on Wednesday. Like if his mind is clouded or not right, or there's something where he is perceived to not be able to do the job as well as would typically be the case, then you might have to make a move. I think that it is incumbent upon Graham Rossini, who my understanding, he was in London on Wednesday, so out of the country, so he wasn't going to be able to meet with Bobby Hurley then. But my understanding is he's supposed to be back for Saturday's game against Cincinnati. And I would imagine, based upon what the comments that Hurley made Wednesday, that they're going to have dialogue, like Saturday before or after the game, maybe even subsequent to that, and the days or after that. And there's going to be an ongoing conversation. Look, there's an understanding that Hurley's in the last year of his contract. He didn't get an extension after last year. It was a show and prove type of a season, very much a major challenge when he had to add 14 new players, only brought back Trevor Best from last year's team. Ultimately, I think that it would take a near miracle for Bobby Hurley to be coaching this team beyond the end of the regular season. Now, whether or not he's coaching all the way until then, I think that remains to be seen based upon the conversations that happen behind the scenes, and then also the way that the team performs. Are they still competing at, as well as they have, or maybe even better than they have? Like, what are his comments about the team in the public? And where is he at? Where's his head at? Like, I don't think Bobby Hurley is a quitter. Like, he's already demonstrated that he has a high competitive will, disposition, desire to be successful. I don't think he's throwing in the towel. I don't think he's going to. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have all the ingredients that you want to have or should have in order to be able to continue. Now, ultimately, Jacob, I don't think it really matters whether ASU has an interim head coach, Nick Irvin, probably, if it were to come to that, because he coached against Santa Clara when Hurley was ejected for the technicals, helped lead a 19-point comeback win, which was pretty impressive. I don't think it matters whether or not there's an interim coach at some point or not. Bottom line is ASU's replacement coach for Bobby Hurley, unless a miracle happens, is going to be hired at some point, probably in the middle of March. And then that new coach will have to try to evaluate the roster. It's not until April 7th that the transfer portal opens. So there's going to be a period of a couple of weeks or perhaps more than that for the coach to be able to evaluate the roster, figure out what's needed to be accomplished in the transfer portal, and then be turned loose on that.
Well, Chris and I will both be at the game on Saturday against Cincinnati. We'll also both be at the T-Cup rematch on January 31st against Arizona. So make sure to stay tuned to all of our Sun Devil Source socials for that. Make sure to also stay tuned to our Devil's Sanctuary board, where Chris earlier this morning posted a lengthy thread detailing everything that's been going down in the Bobby Hurley situation. We've also had members of our board are already on there speculating and creating their own threads talking about potential replacement candidates and what they think about the situation. So make sure to hop in our board if you haven't already to be taking part of all of those conversations. But now, Chris, let's switch gears to the second part of this episode. ASU football's roster is pretty much complete at this point. The portal has closed. There isn't going to be a spring transfer portal this year. So that's it in terms of the portal. Last week, we had a premium members only podcast. So it was around an hour long, giving detailed analysis of all of the ASU editions up to that point for our members only. So you can go back and check that podcast out if you're a premium member of our Devil's Sanctuary board, if you want to check in on that analysis that you might have missed. But a little bit has changed for ASU since that episode. ASU has added a couple players to its secondary, including Chance Rucker, who started as a corner at Michigan State last year. ASU also added another previous starter from Michigan State, Jalen Thompson, defensive end. So a couple things have changed for ASU since that podcast. So we'll have a free version, kind of shorter synopsis in this episode. Chris, ASU per 247 Sports had the 14th best transfer portal class in the country, ranking third in the Big 12 behind only Texas Tech with all of their donors and Oklahoma State, who that one's a little bit iffy on if they really did have a better transfer portal class than ASU because they added 54 new players, bringing in a whole new coaching staff and revamping the roster completely. So with all of that in mind, just from an overarching perspective, what have you made of ASU's transfer portal?
Yeah, it's been pretty impressive overall. I think the question was whether or not ASU would be able to do as well or better than prior classes. Remember, like you had Kenny Dillingham express a lot of confidence in NIL and the direction of the program's resourcing late in the season before he agreed to a new contract. But then the Sam Levitt departure and Javen Robinson and Josh Atkins departures, I think that because those things happened before the portal opened, before ASU had added any new players, there was concern about how well positioned ASU was to be able to replace those guys and to be able to put together a highly competitive transfer class. But those questions have largely been answered now because ASU, and there's still some more players that can be added, even though the portal's closed. It doesn't mean that you can't still add. But ASU is already within 2 or 3 roster spots of being full. So we're not going to see more than a couple more players be added to ASU's roster. They've already added, I think, 24 or maybe 25 transfers. And they, as you said, they rank third in the Big 12. That's a little bit skewed because Oklahoma State took so many players. Like they've got 54 players so far. I mean, that's even more, I think, than Colorado or ASU took in Dillingham and Deion Sanders' first year when they were the number 1 and number 2 teams in transfers, or maybe it's close to what Colorado took. But for ASU to be ranked 14th with this is one of the most important factors. They have an average transfer grade of 86.95. And what does that mean? That's basically like how good that the average player is perceived to be by 24/7 Sports. That's very high. It's not just that ASU is ranked 14th because of big volume of additions. It's that the caliber of the players that they've added is perceived to be very good, and especially at the wide receiver position, where they got 2 of the top 4 or 5 transfers in the country between Omarion and then Reed Harris, Omarion Miller and Reed Harris, and they also got Raiden Vinesbright. I just think that they answered the question about how well that they'd be able to move forward in this revenue share, in this NIL era, with what they were able to put together. And that should lead to less of a drop-off with their team than I had anticipated. Like, I thought, okay, they're going to be replacing most of their starters who are seniors, and then you got a few transfers. It's going to be really hard for them to put together a roster that can be as competitive as they were this year. But now I think it's a legitimate question as to whether or not they could be roughly comparably as good, or maybe not quite. I think that's going to probably depend in part on their quarterback play between Cutter Boley and the addition that they got from Michigan, Mikey Keene, who previously had started at Fresno State and at UCF.
Yeah, Chris, you wrote a detailed evaluation on Cutter Boley, the quarterback transfer from Kentucky. You said that you will have more evaluations of all of ASU's transfers up on our website in the coming days and weeks, so make sure you guys tune into that. But I want to dive deeper into, I know you briefly mentioned it, the offensive side of the ball. ASU had to completely revamp its offensive identity with so many offensive starters headlined by Jordan Tyson declaring for the NFL draft, and then other offensive starters headlined by Sam Levitt and Raleek Brown entering the transfer portal. ASU brought in a ton of guys, as you mentioned, 3 of the top 30 wide receivers, 2 of the top 5 wide receivers, with Omarion Miller, Reed Harris, and Raiden Vines-Bright, who actually grew up an ASU football fan. That was kind of a neat little tidbit that he posted on Instagram after he signed. But with all of the guys that ASU brought in terms of personnel, what did you make of ASU's offensive additions?
Yeah, so they made a strategic decision. Sam Levitt cost twice as much, roughly, as Cutter Boley. And money doesn't grow on trees. Like, sure, it'd be nice if you had like the number one transfer portal class and you just got all the players that you wanted and retained everybody. It doesn't really work that way. And so the strategic decision that was made by ASU was to go with Cutter Boley and Mikey Keene at quarterback. Boley was a redshirt freshman at starter at Kentucky. He played very well against some high-level SEC teams, including Texas, Tennessee, not as well in others, and he was a little bit turnover prone. And I wrote about, in probably, I don't know, 1,500 words, tons of stuff about him. But what they did was they decided, okay, maybe we're not going to have the A-list quarterback. Let's have A-list wide receivers. Let's make it easier on our quarterback in terms of who they can throw the ball to. Omarion Miller and Reed Harris, that is an extremely impressive duo. 2 guys among the top wide receivers in the portal. Either one of them could be a first rounder or a second round NFL draft pick in the future. And that should make it a lot easier at a position that was a non-strength once you got after Jordan Tyson, obviously, right? So they also took care of their protection issues. Josh Adkins, okay, he's an average Big 12 starter that is leaving, but ASU added Jermaine Mitchell. He's a number 1 junior college offensive lineman, number 1 overall junior college prospect. Like, he's a 6'8", 310 pounder who should immediately slot in at left tackle. And then ASU added pretty recently another transfer who had been a starter at Stanford named Luke Baklenko. He was started 5 games at Stanford as a true freshman in 2003, started 9 games in 2004, transferred to Oklahoma. They thought, okay, he might start at Oklahoma. He ended up being their top backup tackle. But now he's a guy who helps replace Champ Westbrooks. I mean, that helps replace Maxi Honator along with Champ Westbrooks is what I meant to say. So you're going to have a competition there probably between those 2 guys. Jalen Clem started in the Sun Bowl and is another option at left tackle along with Mitchell. So now you have multiple new and returning options, players who started in the Sun Bowl with newcomers who are expected to be very good. ASU also added a center who was the starter as a sophomore at Georgia Tech this past season, and Tana Alo-Tupuola, who was spearheaded one of the top rushing attacks in the ACC, despite being a young player, a true sophomore. So that is now a competitor that ASU will have going up against Wade Helton, who started the second half of the season after Ben Coleman went down. And they still have Ben Coleman, and they still have Makai Stewart, and they still have other players who have played a lot with their offensive line. And so I think between their wide receivers, their offensive line, they added a couple of tight end transfers who will support what they have returning there in 2 impressive players in Kamari Anderson and AJ Ia. And they got 2 transfer running backs who I think have a chance to be immediately in the mix for starting roles or some type of roles. I really, in particular, feel like Marquise Gillis, who rushed for almost 1,200 yards at Delaware State last year, is a viable candidate to start. So they're going to need one of these quarterbacks to play really well, or at least reasonably well, for them to compete again, to be in the Big 12 contention late in the season. But I think that they have a chance to be able to accomplish that. And I didn't necessarily feel that that was likely to happen at the end of the season, or when we knew that Sam Leavitt was going to be departing.
Yeah, Chris, a lot of ASU's marquee additions, like you said, were at the wide receiver position or were on the offensive side of the ball. But on the defensive side of the ball, ASU was still able to make a couple splashes. One of the biggest ones, arguably, was AJ Cooper getting a new guy in the linebacker room with Owen Long from Colorado State. He was one of the top tacklers in all of FBS last season. Outside of him, ASU also made many other additions, namely Brian Carrington was getting busy, adding a lot of different guys into ASU's cornerback room as they try to supplement the loss of Keith Abney to the NFL draft. What did you make of the personnel that ASU got on the defensive side of the ball?
It's going to be very difficult to replace starters as good as Jordan Crook and Keyshawn Elliott. But Owen Long, he's a big time addition. Colorado State, okay, it's a lower level, but the guy had 151 tackles, like, to lead the country. And when you watch his film, his playmaking instincts are fantastic. He's not as good of an athlete as Jordan Crook, but he makes up for that with his anticipation, his situational feel and understanding, his skill level, his tackling. Very good. So are they going to be quite as good? I'm not sure, but they got Cyrus Fiaseu back, who was like their third linebacker when healthy, and Martell Hughes is an emerging potential star, somebody who I think with another year of development can be, as good as maybe Keyshawn Elliott or Jordan Crook were a year ago in their first year at ASU, or maybe even better than that. And you put, pardon me. Yeah. And you put Owen Long with that, and now you have a pretty impressive group. And then in the secondary, they needed to make a lot of additions who immediately can play, because, of course, it's not just losing Keith Abney, but Javen Robinson, their other starters, departing. Both of their starting safeties are departing. Xavier Offery didn't play in a Big 12 game, but he's great. And they're losing Miles Rouser. The likelihood, my understanding, is they're probably going to move Boogie Wilson to nickel. We've talked about that on the board. Like, people don't know that publicly. It hasn't been out there on social media, but I posted that like a week and a half ago. So that's another reason why you want to get into the Devil's Sanctuary. But Boogie Nielsen moving to nickel, which is you have to be able to play the run, screen, all that, be physical, pass rush. It's a difficult position. That means they need a free safety. They got Lyric Rawls from Kansas. He's been at 2 different Big 12 schools. He's a starter. I think he was second on the team in tackles. Okay, that's a very good addition. They can move Montana Warren to the boundary safety position to replace Miles Rouser. Okay, but you need starters at corner to replace what you're losing. And they went out and they added Chance Rucker, started 9 games in his 14 appearances at Michigan State. He had an injury that kind of hurt him, put him a little bit behind, but somebody who from his PFF grades were as good basically as Javen Robinson. There's a good chance he could come in and start. They had already earlier added a defensive back from LSU who had been second in the SEC in passes defended, which was a really impressive accomplishment. That's Ashton Stamps. So I think even though he didn't start this past season, LSU is a little bit of a different caliber, and he had started many games in his 2 prior seasons. So the likelihood is those 2 guys are going to battle Rodney Bimage, who I've already said is one of the top young NFL prospects on ASU's team for the starting cornerback spots. And then ASU also got another corner who's very promising from the portal, who's young, Nigel Pringle. And they also added Antoine Belgrave Shorter, who started as a free safety at FIU. And, Antoine Belgrave Shorter was a backup at Penn State as a redshirt freshman who can play either safety position. And they added Josiah McGrew from FIU, who had 52 solo tackles, 64 total tackles, 4 interceptions as a true freshman in this past season in 2015. So they added a whole bunch of guys. And then Defensive end, right? ASU is going to lose its top 4 players. You're going to lose Watley, Clayton Smith. They're going to lose Elijah O'Neal, and whoever else I'm forgetting. They're going to lose. So they're going to lose their top 4 defensive ends. And so what they did was, to replace those guys, they brought in Jalen Thompson, who started 26 games across 3 seasons at Michigan State. He's a veteran, bigger bodied player. That I think is a pretty important addition. That followed Amarion Winston, who started at Baylor and had 26 tackles, 3 sacks, 5.5 tackles for loss this past season. So I think that those two starters, plus they have one of the top junior college defensive ends in the country, which was a pretty big addition, Kirtland Vakalahi. And then they're going to need to get more out of some of their returning players. I think that goes a long way to resolving some of their defensive issues that they have. They're going to have a very different looking defense in a lot of respects, other than maybe at defensive tackle. So we're going to have to evaluate the roster in spring ball.
Yeah, a lot of good information from you right there, Chris. And like I mentioned earlier, if you guys want even more of a breakdown on ASU's transfer portal class, make sure to join the Devil Sanctuary board and check out our members-only premium podcast from about a week ago, breaking down ASU's transfer portal additions player by player in even more detail. But that's about it for ASU football. There's a couple other housekeeping ASU athletics items, on the menu right now. ASU hockey is just completely injury riddled as we record this on Friday afternoon. Tonight, Friday night, ASU kicks off a really important homestand against North Dakota for its chances at potentially having anything in the postseason. ASU lost Colin Potter, who was ASU's first ever first-round NHL draft pick, to the Calgary Flames. He had a season-ending injury. Also injured is Jack Beck, who was a crucial player for ASU. So a whole lot going on with hockey. On the baseball front, we'll have written previews and podcast previews previewing the season for ASU coming out in the coming weeks. So make sure to be on the lookout for that. This comes following, Chris, your reporting of Willie Bloomquist signing that 2-year extension. So an interesting year on tap for ASU baseball as well. But that'll just about do it for this edition of the Sun Devil Source podcast. As I mentioned earlier, Chris and I will be at ASU basketball's game against Cincinnati tomorrow. We'll also have ASU hockey coverage from our hockey reporters tonight against North Dakota. So make sure to check out all of that coverage over the coming days on our Sun Devil Source socials and sundevilsource.com. We appreciate everybody who tuned into this podcast episode, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.